Thanks to the onset of the internet, the ability to discuss and dissect different mysteries has never been easier. So from the creepiest Mandela Effect to the man who vanished in thin air, join us. First coined in 2009, the Mandela Effect refers to various alternate memories, in which a large group of people recall something that never happened. However, one of the most recent, and one of the most creepy effects, involves the Lisanne case. For the rare few who still haven't heard of it, after a surveillance video captured her bizarre behaviour, she was found dead inside the hotel water tower. Weirder still, the tank catch was closed, meaning it was simply impossible for her to have entered it. At least that's what people remember. Yet contrary to their beliefs, the tank was always shut. To many enthusiasts of the case, this makes no sense, as it removes a crucial part of the mystery. In fact, they specifically recall that there have been multiple debates over whether Elisa could ever open the hatch. Either way, this odd detail makes the creepy case even creepier. A carefree spirit with a love for nature, 18-year-old Joshua Maddux lived in the Pike National Forest in Colorado. As such, when in May 2008 he went to go take a walk, everything seemed fine. However, he never came back. 7 years later, and less than a mile away, his mummified body was discovered in the chimney of an old cabin. According to the man who found him, Chuck Morgan, the cabin had fallen into a state of disrepair. As such, he had taken to tearing it down, at which point he uncovered the body. Of course, everyone was puzzled, but the answer seemed clear. Maddux had accidentally fallen into the chimney and eventually died from hypothermia. Yet Chuck questioned this conclusion. Intriguingly, he revealed the chimney was fitted with a rebar, a mesh of steel wires used to keep out animals. And it wasn't only this that caused doubt. The body had been found in a fetal position, meaning Maddux would have had to enter head first. Weirder still, he was wearing only a thin thermal shirt, with his clothes found next to the fireplace. This would mean that for some reason, Maddux took off his clothes, climbed on the roof, and went down the chimney head first. No doubt this seems unlikely, and many people, especially Chuck, are convinced it wasn't an accident. Ever since the death of its founder, the Church of Scientology has been under the control of David Miscavige. Often described as a psychopath, he was joined in his role by his wife Shelly, herself a malicious personality. At least that was until 2006, when she inexplicably disappeared. Responsible for the project to find Tom Cruise a new wife, members were shocked when she failed to attend his wedding. Curious, they started to question David, but were always sharply rebuked. This continued until 2007, when Shelly briefly reappeared at her father's funeral, only to vanish once more. One member who was particularly concerned by this was Leah Remini, who eventually decided to leave the church. In 2013, she filed a missing persons report with the LAPD. However, Remini claims that she hasn't received any type of follow-up, while detectives maintain that they met Shelly in person. Many though are skeptical of this, and postulate the church paid off the police department. So if Shelly isn't safe, where is she, and how is she? Some theories believe that she upset David, and was subsequently murdered. Supporting this is the fact the church could easily show a picture of Shelly to save face, but never have. Alternatively, others contend she suffered a psychotic break, and that members have attempted to hide her illness. This could make sense, as the church are opposed to any kind of psychiatric care. Still, despite these theories, information is hard to come by, and the case remains a mystery. Imagine a mystery in which someone seems to literally vanish in thin air. This is the case of Columbus student Brian Shaffer. On March 31st, 2006, after an evening of bar hopping, he and his friend Clint decided to end their night at the Ugly Tuna Saloon. However, in a seriously bizarre twist, surveillance cameras show Brian enter the bar, but never leave. Based on the CCTV, Brian leaves the bar at 1:55 AM. Here he briefly talks to two women, before coming back inside. Just over 5 minutes later, the tuna closes. This means that between the point where Brian re-entered and when the bar shut, Brian somehow vanished. But how? And where to? After scouring the surveillance tapes for hours on end, police are confident he never left via the escalator, a belief shared by Clint. According to him, he both scanned the entire bar and waited outside, but since he never saw Brian, he assumed he'd already gone home. With this testimony, it must mean that Brian either died inside the bar, or for some reason left via the other exit. But since this was a service store that led to a construction site, police found this improbable. Instead, they entertained the idea that Brian was murdered, and his body somehow transported outside. The alternate theory is that Brian did leave out of the service exit, perhaps with the desire to commit suicide. After all, he was still suffering with the grief of losing his mother only 3 weeks earlier. Yet at the same time, he was planning on proposing to his girlfriend. So what do you think happened to Brian Shaffer? In the early hours of April 18th, 2016, Texan fitness instructor Terry Bevers arrived at the Creekside Church to prepare for her next class. However, unaware to Terry, or Missy as she was better known, her killer was fast approaching. 30 minutes prior to her arrival, surveillance cameras captured this uniformed figure. Ever since this video was released, both police and amateur researchers have desperately attempted to work out who the person is. Initially, police assumed the killer was male, but some now lean towards a female suspect. Interestingly, it is well established that both Missy and her husband Brandon had multiple affairs. This led to theories that the killer was a disgruntled partner. Still, based on various forums, it seems the primary suspect is Randy Bevers, Missy's father-in-law. Eerily, researchers have pointed out that both Randy and the perpetrator share an identical gait. Yet despite this observation, authorities have ruled him out. Regardless, there's no doubt that the murder wasn't random, but both methodically planned and deeply personal. A story as tragic as it is terrifying, the massacre of the Miyazawa family still lingers in the Japanese conscious. On the night of December 30th, 2000, as most of the family slept, someone broke into their home. According to the official account, he started with Ray, smothering him in his sleep. At this point, the father Mikio, likely having heard a disturbance, went to go investigate. Here he encountered the home invader on the stairs, and the two proceeded to scuffle. However, without a weapon, Mikio stood little chance, and was soon disposed of. Concurrent to this latest murder, Izuku and Nina retreated to the loft, whilst the killer retrieved another knife from the kitchen. Still, despite their best efforts, they too were brutally murdered. Yet unlike similar massacres, the killer didn't leave, but instead made himself at home. For the next several hours, he ate their food, browsed the internet, and finally took a nap. Then, just to seal his arrogance, he left his clothes in the bedroom. Obviously, this all resulted in numerous DNA clues, but unfortunately, they matched no one. In fact, despite the killer's brazen behaviour, the police had virtually no evidence. They were however certain that the murder wasn't a robbery, as the killer barely took any money. Instead, they suspected he might be a hitman. Interestingly, the killer had scanned through the family's entire credit cards and bank books, seemingly looking to confirm their identification. Still, apart from this, there is little to go on, and the perpetrator has never been found. After spending the entire day on his latest case, attorney Jonathan Luna left a voicemail saying he would be shortly leaving the office to finish at home. At the time, Luna was in the midst of a major drug scandal and planned to present his case the following morning. However, said morning would actually see the discovery of his corpse. On December 3rd, 2003, Luna's body was found face down in a shallow creek in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, about 90 miles away from his office. He had been stabbed a total of 36 times, though he'd officially died from drowning. Unsurprisingly, the county coroner's office ruled his death was a homicide, yet the FBI were adamant he'd taken his own life. By their report, Luna had left his office at 11:30, driven into Delaware, and continued on until Lancaster County, where he arrived about 4. There he'd purposefully, or accidentally cut an artery, and bled to death. Meanwhile, the FBI maintained the other stab cuts were just hesitant wounds, yet the coroner insisted they were consistent with torture. Still, this wasn't the only odd detail. Luna's hands were shredded from defensive wounds, while his scrotum had been brutally slashed. Weirdest of all, he'd apparently stabbed himself in the back. Of course, many are doubtful of this, and are confident Luna wasn't alone. Interestingly, the fact there was blood in the back seat may indicate he was a passenger at some point, and not the driver. This would make perfect sense, as Luna had left his glasses at the office, especially odd since he was completely reliant on them. So why, despite this mounting evidence, is the FBI determined to prove it was a suicide? Is it possible they're in a cover-up, perhaps relating to one of Luna's cases? Whatever the truth, it's certainly bizarre. Unlike the other mysteries, this all started with a simple knock at the door. According to her family, Kanika Powell was a clever and cautious woman, and so when a mystery man arrived at her apartment with a shady backstory, she was unsurprisingly skeptical. The man claimed he was from the FBI, and that he was looking for Kanika Powell. By all accounts, it seems she did everything right in this situation. She refused to open the door without seeing proper identification, and later reported the incident to the police. She also called the FBI, who insisted they hadn't sent anyone. Unnerved by this, Powell hoped it was all a prank, but just 5 days later, there was another knock at the door. This wasn't the same man, but was just as suspicious. He said he was there to deliver a package. However, when he said he'd go retrieve it, he never came back. Even stranger, Powell noticed there was no package, nor a note to where it could be collected. Still, while this scared her further, she knew she had to run some errands, and so decided to leave in the daytime. Yet this seeming smart decision would end up to be a fatal mistake. As Powell returned to her apartment, someone was waiting in the hallway. Before she had any time to react, she was shot multiple times. Since her keys and wallet were found next to her body, robbery was ruled out, as well as all other usual motives. Instead, police considered the possibility that Powell was murdered due to her occupation. Interestingly, she worked as a security contractor and even had top secret clearance. In fact, her job was so confidential that all her mother knew was that she had some association with the military. So if Powell's work was the motive, could the murder have been a planned hit? Notably, both visitors asked if Kanika Powell was there, as though to identify their target. Perhaps, as some believe, she stumbled upon something she wasn't meant to. In 2014, 2 Dutch students set off on the adventure of a lifetime. However, the trip would end in their deaths. On April 1st, Lisanne Froon and Kris Kremers arrived in the town of Boquete, Panama. Both nature lovers, they planned to spend their first day hiking. Yet as it became dark, it was realised that they still hadn't returned. Soon Panama authorities were alerted and quickly launched an intensive search. But despite such widespread efforts, there was no sign of the pair. Indeed, it was actually months before any evidence turned up, when a tribeswoman found Froon's backpack. Yet what seemed like the first step towards solving the case only made it that much more bizarre. 1 week after the women vanished, they'd taken over 90 photos between 1 and 4 AM. Bizarrely, most are just blackness, while others show blurry shots of the wilderness. Since the pictures have no purpose, it's believed they were using the camera flash to provide light. Still, some contend the photos were an unsuccessful attempt to warn off a predator. Regardless, the discovery of the backpack led to a renewed search, and police scoured the area where it'd been found. This time though, they were looking for the women's remains, and it wasn't long before they found them. Based on the autopsies, it seems Froon and Kremers both fell from a cliff, and subsequently perished in the elements. Yet others maintain there is more to the story. For one, they question how they survived over 10 days with a complete lack of experience. So, is this evidence of murder, or is it all just an accident? Three years ago, 2 young girls went for a walk. What happened next remains a mystery to all but the man who killed them. It was an unexpected day off from school, and friends 14-year-old Liberty German and 13-year-old Abigail Williams decided to spend their time at the trails. However, when Libby's dad arrived to pick them up, they were nowhere to be found. Concerned, he called the sheriff's department, but since the case wasn't considered an emergency, they only conducted a quick sweep. This though all changed the next day, when a volunteer stumbled upon the girls' bodies, less than a mile from where they'd been dropped off. Sadly, the person responsible is unknown, yet there are some clues towards his identification. It seems that in the time before their death, Libby took a picture of this man. Meanwhile, at the same time, she was able to record his voice. Unfortunately, this is the last piece of data on the phone, but there is hope the photo will be enough. Interestingly, many internet sleuths are preoccupied with Charles Eldridge, a suspected child molester. Strangely, he bears an undeniable resemblance to the killer. Regardless, whether Eldridge is responsible, or someone else, we can only hope the case is solved soon.